Hello, everyone. I am delighted to be with you, to be sharing this passion of mine that has obsessed me for 13 years. The first thing I'd like to talk about is this wonderful picture that I hope you can all see on your screen. It's by the European photographer Brute Carniolis, and he was gracious enough to let us use this image for our pilgrimage. What I want you to invite you to look at is that what we see is a very contemplative woman who is holding in her left hand an egg, and on the right side of the image what you see is, on her right, you see a tree with a constellation of stars. And as soon as I first saw this image, I thought, what a beautiful, beautiful symbol for who Mary Magdalene has been throughout the centuries and who she is personally for me. One of the symbols that she holds then is this idea in the egg of transformation, of alchemical change. This goes back to some of the earliest legends of Mary Magdalene as the apostle of the apostles. Part of the story of the myths of her legends is that she went to appear before the Emperor Tiresias to complain about the treatment of Jesus through Pontius Pilate. And as she was telling this story, according to myth and legend, the emperor said, well, that could no more happen than that the egg in your hand turned red. Well, according to myth and legend, that is exactly what happened, and it is from that event that we trace the Christian tradition of giving Easter eggs at Easter time, and in particular in the Orthodox churches in the East, red Easter eggs. So as you look at the art around the world, very often you will see Magdalene either with a white egg or a red egg, two very important colors in the alchemical process. The other part of this photograph of the tree and the constellation is also something that is deeply suggestive, and in my years of studying and traveling and searching and pilgrimage, I have become completely convinced that Mary Magdalene is in fact at the root of what I would call the contemplative tree. She is at the very base of the beginning of the roots of the monastic tradition that stretches from the shores of Provence up through the long, long legacy of Benedictine spirituality, with an important role in Franciscan monastic life and Dominican monastic life. This is evidenced in our current times joyfully by Pope Francis himself proclaiming that Mary Magdalene is a model for all Christians and for all women. I would suggest that she has been nothing but the apostle to the apostles in many of the contemplative traditions, despite the fact that her image archetypally has carried so many other images throughout the centuries. If we turn to the biblical text, what we find about Mary Magdalene is a small amount of information that is very consistent. She is portrayed in all four of the gospel texts as a very important disciple of Jesus. In the Gospel of Luke, she is mentioned as being a wealthy woman who enables Jesus' ministry. We have her present in all the Gospels as being a faithful and courageous witness to suffering in the crucifixion, and that she stands there at the foot of the cross sometimes from a distance in other tellings, but present to hold all the magnitude of the suffering of her teacher. One of the fascinating things about the biblical texts is while they do not agree on who else is present during this crucifixion, all of the Gospels agree that Mary Magdalene was there. Just an example, notice that here in Mark 15, one of the women who is named at the foot of the cross, at the scene of the cross, is Salome. She doesn't appear in the other Gospel texts, but Mary Magdalene appears in all of them. We have the scenes from the Bible of her cradling the Jesus during the deposition, of her being present till the very end, and in art across the centuries that she is seen very tenderly, in this case by Botticello, cradling Christ's head. And then we have the beautiful tradition of the resurrection stories, which, while they differ in virtually every other aspect, what time of day, who else was there, when did it happen, what was said, they're all very consistent that Mary Magdalene was present. And in the Gospel of John, it is she alone who receives the blessing and the benediction of being the first to see Jesus in his risen form. The Gospels then tell us that Mary Magdalene is charged with this unique role to proclaim what she has seen, what she has witnessed with her own eyes, and that she goes and proclaims this to the other disciples who are still huddled in fear. And this is where we trace her role as the apostle to the apostles, a phrase that we might actually translate as the teacher of teachers. So that's who we have in the canonical texts, Mary Magdalene as an icon of a courageous, faithful, loyal disciple who is charged by Jesus personally with a critical, important message for all of humanity. Throughout the centuries, Magdalene, however, has held up a mirror of other, what I would call archetypal currents in the culture. And so throughout the centuries, we have gotten so many other different kinds of images of Magdalene. We see her as the voluptuous penitent prostitute throughout the centuries. We see her as the maiden of the Grail. We have images that date back actually several centuries. This one is from the turn of the century with Eric Gill, of her being related to the Song of Solomon, the erotic wise texts that was the great favorite of monastics as the great love song. And from her earliest feast days, the Song of Songs was intimately connected with Mary Magdalene. That's an image that we find reawakening in our own time. There are so many images of all different races where Magdalene and Jesus have this profoundly intimate relationship. And of course, the Da Vinci Code brought that out. The strain that I'll be focusing on at Chartres, however, is really Magdalene's role as teacher. Magdalene's role as prophet, Magdalene's role as the inner disciple who focuses on the cultivation of wisdom that is passed to her through her beloved rabbi. And this image is an image that is filled, I believe, with power and dignity and the capacity to awaken within us our own latent abilities for healing, wholeness, proclamation, truth-telling, and witness, qualities which are urgently needed in our time. For me, Mary Magdalene stands as this iconic symbol of someone who is able to be present for the deepest suffering of humanity and yet to still open her heart to the possibilities of joy, new life, and transformation. And that's a message I believe we are so urgently in need of right now. One of the things that fascinates me, and one of the things we'll be discussing at Chartres, is the way that the feminine has been systematically cut out of the picture of history. This image is one that I took about 15 years ago at the Vatican Museum. And if you look at the image, what you'll see is the classic picture of the Virgin Mary enthroned with baby Jesus on her lap, and she is surrounded by saints. But if you look closely to your left of the throne, you'll see that there's a missing piece. It looks as if something has been airbrushed or cut out of the picture. And this stands as such a potent symbol for what has happened throughout history, that Magdalene's rightful place as the teacher of teachers, the apostle of apostles, the most faithful and loyal and courageous and wise of all the disciples, was systematically cut out of the picture over the centuries. So we'll do a little investigative work to find some of these missing pieces. In order to do that, we will take a look at some of the really exciting early Christian documents that were hid by Pacomian monks in the 4th century in Egypt. These were texts that were in wide circulation amongst communities of early Christians and then were banned and cut out of the story of Christianity. And a collection of these remained hidden in the deserts of Nag Hammadi until 1945 when they were reclaimed again. These texts give us a fuller and richer perspective. All of the texts that I'll be looking at and exploring expand on Magdalene's pivotal role as a teacher and as the wise student of Jesus who is capable of profound insight. So we'll look briefly at texts like the Gospel of Thomas and the Dialogue of the Savior and the Gospel of Philip, all of which complete our portrayal of Magdalene as this apostle of great wisdom. We'll also look at some other texts used by early Christians, again, documents that have been recovered in our own times, like the Gospel of Mary, which is a set of teachings in her own name, the Pistis Sophia, and something called the Psalms of Heraclides. All of these texts amplify our image of Magdalene as wise teacher. But I will also be turning to other traditions squarely within the Orthodox Christian tradition, images of the lineage that Magdalene has passed down throughout the centuries. We're going to be looking at her as this beacon of spiritual authority. This image that you see on your screen right now is a banner that was used by a Franciscan confraternity society in the Middle Ages. In it you see Magdalene in her scarlet cloak holding her jar of healing balm and holding Christ on the cross. In her massive and generous lap, she holds then both suffering and healing and hope. She's surrounded by choirs of angels singing hymns of praise in her name. We will find and discover that there is a long and gorgeous tradition of music written in Magdalene's name that was used for the liturgies, particularly of Holy Week, and especially for Maundy Thursday. Those slightly frightening figures that you see kneeling at Magdalene's feet in white were the robes that the community of lay people who lived in Florence and Cortona and other places throughout Italy would wear as they tended plague victims. Many of the confraternities dedicated to Mary Magdalene had a triple role. Their job was to look after the dying, and that's why they wear those hoods to protect themselves from plague. Their job was to meet weekly for lay-led celebrations of music, and they were to also to be responsible for the service of Maundy Thursday, the service of the washing of the feet, a tradition that actually traces its way back to Mary Magdalene herself. We'll see then that Mary Magdalene has stood as this figure of towering spiritual authority. This is one of my favorite images. It's from the Basilica of St. Francis, who had his own very particular devotion to Mary Magdalene that we'll explore. And we'll see, as we see in this image by Giotto, that there have been centuries upon centuries upon centuries of cardinals, of bishops, of popes, and of saints who have knelt at her feet, seeing in her this towering spiritual leader that has given them strength and courage and purpose. So part of my hope with our week at Chartres is to fill in these missing pieces of the lost feminine, to find and to reclaim these ancient Christian traditions, the story of how Mary Magdalene inspired the monastic movement and how she's inspired pilgrimage throughout the centuries. This image that you now see before you is painted in the French Orthodox Cathedral of Saint-Michel-du-Var in Provence. And here, once again, you see Magdalene towering as a figure of spiritual strength, her red cloak billowing to shelter centuries upon centuries upon centuries of saints, here including St. Francis of Assisi and Hildegard of Bingen. We'll trace this spiritual lineage while we're in Chartres. And while we're there, we're going to celebrate the fact that the very tradition of pilgrimage is intimately interwoven with Mary Magdalene's own story. That pilgrimage through France began right around the year 1000 and took on this enormous importance during the Middle Ages. At that point in time, there were 4 pathways that began in different regions of France, joined together in the Pyrenees, and continued all the way to Santiago de Compostela. This is now known as the Camino or the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage. But throughout France, for much of the Middle Ages, this was known as the Chemin de Marie, the Way of Mary. And one of the sites that you see here on your map, Vézelay, is actually the basilica where Mary Magdalene's relics reside. And it's where St. Francis began to make his own pilgrimage on the Santiago Compostela. Throughout all four of these pathways throughout France, there is this deep and long and profound tradition of spiritual transformation through music, through prayer, through art, and through contemplation. And each one of those elements has a deep connection to Mary Magdalene. So during our time at Chartres, we will actually learn some of these medieval pilgrim songs that are gorgeous and joyous, and we'll look for the scallop shell, the symbol of the pilgrim, which has long been the symbol of the feminine. This coquille Saint-Jacques, as it's known in France, also evokes the idea of the pearl, and we'll discuss how the pearl of great price and the scallop shell all are intimately connected with Magdalene. We see that same scallop shell symbol actually on the cookies that bear her name, La Madeleine, as another reminder of pilgrimage. And I'll share with you some of the pilgrimage journeys that I've been on as I've collected these missing pieces, places like La Madeleine, which is named for her in the Dordogne, and the most surprising place that I've been to in the Haute-Provence, which is now known as the Trail of Time, but was originally part of the Chemin de Marie. And for those of you who are fans of that magnificent film, Rivers and Tides, which documented the great Scottish land artist Andy Goldsworthy, I'll be exploring about how this Trail of Time has these markers. Notice again that the markers, which are about 12 to 14 feet tall, bear once again the shape of that egg of transformation. Now, as for Chartres itself, it is one of these magical places. I have been lucky enough to go on many pilgrimages. I think this will be my 7th with Veriditas to Chartres Cathedral. Each one has had its own transformative effect on my soul. Each one has lingered in my heart with memories of its companionship, its community, and its beauty. It is a quintessential quaint little village, and what you see here in this picture by John Ritter is that there is this little river that weaves its way around Chartres, enclosing it almost like a cocoon. And here is the great story of pilgrimage of the Middle Ages, as guilds gathered together and quarried stone and carried them up to the hillside, singing songs of devotion and peace during a time of war, in order that they might build this alchemical temple of transformation. What you see here in this image is an aerial shot of what has been called the grandest and most magnificent Gothic cathedral in the world. Notice that the two towers are really different from each other. They have been referred to as the Tower of the Sun and the Tower of the Moon. And while architecturally they represent different styles, they convey a message that this is in fact a place where over the centuries the tension of the opposites has been held in such a way that healing and wholeness and transformation have happened time and time and time again. Before there were universities in Paris and Oxford and Bologna, this was one of the greatest sites of learning in the entire Western world. And if you wished to dive deep into the wisdom traditions of philosophy, of music, of sacred geometry, of rhetoric, this is the place that you would go. Chartres Cathedral had a 7-year curriculum in which one studied the great tradition of the classical age. And in fact, as one enters what's known as the scholar's doorway here, in between the Tower of the Sun and the Tower of the Moon, in the doorway that rests below that great and magnificent rose window, you actually see figures like Aristotle and Pythagoras carved into the scholar's doorway, inviting you to connect to the wisdom of the centuries. It's going to be one of my great joys while here at Chartres Cathedral to talk not only about Mary Magdalene and the contemplative Christian tradition, but also to talk about how this was preserved at Chartres in both its architecture and its medieval school mystery teachings, as we explore the great wisdom of the past and how it continues throughout this monument of stone that has sometimes been called a symphony in stone. So we'll have chances to explore the extraordinary, extraordinary collection of art, the statues carved on the outside of the cathedral, and we'll be lucky enough to have guided tours on the inside with some of the world's foremost art historians. The crown jewel of this pilgrimage, however, is without a doubt for me the Labyrinth Walk. Now, if you go to Chartres by yourself, the Labyrinth is only uncovered, as you see it is here in this picture, between 6 to 9 months of the year. And that it is only regularly available to walk on Fridays between, I think it is 10 and 2. There is limited access to actually walk this pilgrim path the way that centuries of Christians walked it as a tool of transformation from the moment it went into the cathedral in the 13th century. But what makes Veriditas so extraordinary is that Dr. Lauren Chartres has created this pilgrimage that now, I've lost track of how many years, I think it's about 20 or 25 years that this has been offered as a sacred journey. And it is truly a magnificent and extraordinary experience. The first time I went on this, which was about 15 years ago, I said that it was the trip of a lifetime. Well, I was compelled to do it the next year and the next and become a Veriditas trained facilitator. And now I'm coming back to do the keynote presentation here. I cannot sing its praises highly enough, because what we get to do is that we get to actually begin not where everyone else sees the labyrinth. Here you see it in its view during the week and most times of the year where it's covered by chairs, but we get to begin our journey in the 9th century crypt, way below, underground, where all these magnificent stained glass windows are. And it's here that we begin to work this special experience. We'll see this Black Madonna, Our Lady of Under the Earth, that's by this ancient well. We'll walk a path lit by 9,000 candles that has been used for centuries upon centuries as a pathway of devotion. And as we alight the staircase, we come into the body of the cathedral then, and what we get to see is we get to see by the fading evening light, lit up as if we're in an underneath water aquarium, this image, the cathedral labyrinth, lit by candles and with musicians who are singing songs that shimmer and echo and resonate with the story of the Middle Ages, the time when it was built. We'll have our own private ceremony then down in the crypt and then up here at the labyrinth. And there are no words for this experience. It has changed my life again and again and again. I've had people say to me that this is the closest thing to the Eleusinian mysteries that they imagine still existing on this planet, and I tend to agree with them. So this is the journey that we'll be going on in Chartres, a wonderful pilgrimage in which our mornings will be spent with contemplative prayer and pilgrim songs, a chance to share, a chance to do some liturgical dance, and then the stories of Mary Magdalene throughout the centuries, both those that are found in the canonical texts, those that have been rediscovered in Egypt in our times, and those that have persisted in the quiet and hidden corners of monasteries throughout the ages. I hope you will consider joining us on this extraordinary event. If you wish to know more about Mary Magdalene and celebrate her, I encourage you to do so in your own way. Her feast day is coming up. I know this feast day well. It happens to be my own birthday, July 22nd. And you might look for Magdalene feast events across the country. I know of several that are happening from Baton Rouge to Houston, and there are many here in the San Francisco Bay Area, including a Magdalene Festival I will be conducting from July 21st to the 23rd in Sonoma County. Other parts of how Magdalene's story weaves throughout the artistic and musical traditions and legends of the past are going to be explored also in the coming weeks. There will be a live stream course on the Black Madonna with reference to the connection between the Black Madonna and Mary Magdalene. And you can find information about those events and others at my own website, www.kayleenasbo.com. And to enroll in our pilgrimage at Chartres Cathedral, the Walking a Sacred Path, you can see Veriditas' home site, www.veriditas.org, Chartres. And it would be a great delight to welcome you on this merry band of pilgrims that are coming from all over the world to sing together, to pray together, to learn together, to dive deeply to find the wisdom that whispers inside the depths of each human heart. One of my favorite texts is the Gospel of Mary. And in that, one of Magdalene's teaching is that she talks about how the good has come into our midst to reunite us with our true essence. I can tell you from my own experiences that few things have done this so powerfully to reunite me with the good and to connect me with the voice that whispers in my own heart as the Veriditas pilgrimage to Chartres. If you'd like to learn anything more, if there's anything that is buzzing inside of you about Mary Magdalene as this apostle to apostles right now, or if you'd like to know more about this extraordinary tradition of pilgrimage that began in the Middle Ages at Chartres Cathedral and really, really was a pathway of peace during a time of war. The building of this cathedral just stands as such an extraordinary mirror for what the human being community is capable of when we join together, when we come from a place of longing for peace and we do our own inner work and we join together to create a monument of beauty. Chartres still stands as the beacon, the lighthouse on the hill, to guide us as to what is possible even during the darkest and most desperate of times. It has been my great joy, and I hope to see many of you either at Chartres, or if you can't fly away to France this year, you can go to my website, KayleenAsbo.com, to see if there are things that you might be able to go to. I do speak across the country, so if you'd like to get on the mailing list to find out about Magdalene workshops on the East Coast or the South, or here in the San Francisco Bay Area in Sonoma County, you're welcome to join my mailing list, and I hope to meet you soon.